So consider, as though for the first time, the foundational claim of Christianity. The claim is this, that miracle stories of a sort that today surround a person like Saita Said Baba become especially compelling when you set them in the pre-scientific religious context of the first century Roman Empire, decades after their supposed occurrence. We have Saita Said Baba's miracle stories attested to by thousands upon thousands of living eyewitnesses, and they don't even merit an hour on the Discovery Channel. But you place a few miracle stories in some ancient books, and half the people on this earth think it a legitimate project to organize their lives around them.
Sam Harris made a case against miracles. He contrasts the miracles of Jesus with supposed present-day miracles. Since reasonable people generally don't believe that miracles attributed to, for example, Saita Said Baba are real, we should especially don't believe miracle claims from 2000 years ago. If Harris is right, then it is irrational to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, according to Harris, it is irrational to believe Christianity is true. In this video, I will show you that Harris is wrong and that a compelling case can be made that Jesus rose from the dead. Welcome to the channel. My goal is to help you see that Christianity is true. In my last video, I developed a number of criteria with which we can distinguish a natural occurrence from a miracle. A miracle can be defined as an act of a supernatural agent in the natural world. There are two steps to come to the conclusion that a miracle has occurred. The first thing we need to do is show that an intelligent cause, rather than a natural cause, is the best explanation for the event. The second thing we need to do is show that the supernatural agent, rather than a human agent, is the best explanation for the event. If you want to take a closer look at these steps, then I recommend that you first watch my previous video. Link is in the description below. To make this video as focused as possible, I will not make a case for the truth of the relevant historical facts. The only thing I will say now is that most New Testament scholars agree that these events actually occurred, so we should take them very seriously. The facts are: the tomb of Jesus was found empty by some of his women followers. Different individuals and even groups of people claimed that Jesus appeared to them after his death. And the disciples sincerely believed that Jesus resurrected, and they were willing to die for that belief. So what is the best explanation for these facts? First, we need to determine whether the best explanation for these events is a natural or an intelligent cause. Intelligent design theorists have developed two criteria to determine this. Let's start with the first one and apply them to the historical facts. The event is highly improbable. Fact number 1, the empty tomb. In the Gospel of Matthew, we read that Jesus was buried in a new grave of a rich man called Joseph of Arimathea. We read in Matthew the following: "And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the entrance of the tomb, and went away." What is the chance that some natural cause could make the body disappear? It would be highly improbable that wild dogs, for example, ate the body, or that his body was completely decomposed within 3 days. Some even say that he didn't actually die. As far as I know, there's not a single serious New Testament historian who thinks this. And for many good reasons. Prior to crucifixion, Jesus was severely flogged. Some even died because of the flogging process. That's how brutal it was. And then he suffered on the cross for 6 hours. After that, we read that a Roman soldier put a spear in his side to make sure he was dead. Let's read. "But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe." It's clear that Jesus was dead when he was laid in the tomb, that's for sure. Fact number 2, the appearances. What individuals and groups are we specifically talking about? The Apostle Paul summarizes it in 1 Corinthians and says the following: "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." The only possible natural cause for their experiences seems to be that they all hallucinated. It is true that sometimes people hallucinate about deceased loved ones, but it is highly improbable that such a person would conclude that therefore his or her loved one rose from the dead. They usually know that their loved one didn't really rise from the dead. And besides, we are not talking about one person who truly believed that they saw the risen Jesus, we are talking about more than 500 people. 500 people who all hallucinate at the same time is highly unlikely. You might therefore be skeptical that this is a historical fact, but there's good reason to believe that this really happened. Paul apparently had personal contact with these people, since he knew that some had died. This can be inferred from Paul's comment, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Why did Paul say this? New Testament scholar C.H. Dodd answers this question. There can hardly be any purpose in mentioning the fact that most of the 500 are still alive, unless Paul is saying, in effect, the witnesses are there to be questioned. Paul is basically saying, if you don't believe me, I can let the eyewitnesses speak for themselves. Therefore, we can be confident that this event occurred even though there's not a reasonable natural explanation for this event. It is highly improbable that 500 people were so deluded as to truly believe that Jesus appeared to them. Some skeptics argue that they wanted this to be true so much, because their messianic leader was dead, that they started to believe it as a result of extreme wishful thinking. This is highly improbable, and it also wouldn't explain the radical conversions of Jesus' brother James and Paul. They were both very skeptical about Jesus, to say the least. Paul even actively persecuted Christians. He hated Christians and Christianity, so he didn't want it to be true, and yet he claimed that Jesus appeared to him. So we can conclude that it is highly improbable that this event is the result of some natural cause. Fact number 3. The sincere belief of the disciples. Is there a plausible natural explanation that the disciples changed from scared individuals to joyful and courageous people who were willing to die for the belief that Jesus rose from the dead? This is highly unlikely for similar reasons as the second fact. They claim to have seen Jesus firsthand. If they didn't actually see him, they must have been having a very extreme hallucination. The chance that even one person has that is highly improbable, let alone all disciples. What's also important to notice is that they didn't think that Jesus rose spiritually, but physically. In the Gospel of Luke we read the following. Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were startled and frightened and thought they saw a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have." It is highly improbable that one of the 3 historical facts has a natural cause, but for all 3 of them to have a natural explanation is astronomically improbable. But of course, this in itself does not justify us to conclude that an intelligent cause is the best explanation for the historical facts. Highly improbable things happen all the time. Only if these facts conform to an independently given pattern can we justify a design inference. So let's see whether the historical facts conform to an independently given pattern. When I discuss the resurrection with unbelievers, they sometimes say that these facts, even though it is highly improbable that they are the result of some natural cause, it is still more probable than an actual resurrection, because resurrections never happen as far as we know. Sometimes Elvis Presley is given as an example. After he died, many people have claimed that they have seen him after his death. Nobody in his right mind draws the conclusion that therefore Elvis rose from the dead. Even if there is compelling evidence that Elvis was alive after his supposed death, then the conclusion would not be that he resurrected, but that he never really died. So why shouldn't we conclude the same about Jesus? There's a lot to say in response to this, but I want to focus on a very important difference between the supposed appearances of Elvis and Jesus. The event that Elvis would rise from the dead does not conform to an independently given pattern, while the resurrection of Jesus does. If you can attribute a clear function or purpose that can explain the event, then there is an independently given pattern. For example, if you play poker with a friend and that friend gets 5 royal flushes in a row, you have good reason to suspect that he is cheating, because this event is not only highly improbable, it also conforms to an independently given pattern. A royal flush is the highest card combination, and the purpose or function of getting this is to win the game. If it happens 5 or more times in a row, then the pattern becomes obvious. Now in the case of Elvis, there is no clear function or purpose to think that God would make him rise from the dead. It would be a completely arbitrary and random event. So if there would be evidence that Elvis really was alive after his supposed death, then we would have to look for a natural or human explanation. Maybe Elvis didn't really die, or the people who claimed to have seen them hallucinated, or they had some ulterior motive to make this up. When we compare Elvis with Jesus, we see a huge difference. First, the supposed appearances are not nearly as compelling as the appearances of Jesus. With Elvis we only have silly stories, such as that he can be seen in the background of the movie Home Alone. With Jesus we have different individuals and even a large group of over 500 people who claim to have seen and even spoken him. Second, they were willing to die for that belief. Third, Jesus' tomb was found empty, and fourth, the resurrection of Jesus is not without context, to put it mildly. We have thousands of years of prophecies about him. This was not an ordinary man. Jesus also didn't think he was ordinary. He claimed to be the Son of God, God himself, and he even predicted that he would be killed and that he would rise from the dead. If somebody comes into this world as the fulfilling of thousands of years of prophecies, claims to be God, and even predicts that he will rise from the dead, it is safe to say that we have a very clear, independently given pattern. In light of this huge context, the empty tomb, the appearances, and the sincere belief of the disciples are really powerful evidence that this must be the result of an intelligent cause rather than some natural cause. But now you might think, so what? This does not prove that God performed a miracle. Maybe the intelligent cause is human. Maybe it is all a big conspiracy. He didn't really rise from the dead. He and the disciples just fooled all of us. Let's investigate this. There are two more criteria. If these can be applied to the historical facts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus, then we are rational to conclude that the miracle has occurred. Just like with the criteria for intelligent design, it is important to have a priority order of explanation. We start with the simple explanation, which in this case is the human agent, and only if this explanation fails can we consider God as an explanation. So if we cannot gather enough information regarding the event, then the standard explanation is that a human agent is responsible. The first criterion is that it is highly improbable that a human or humans can make these events happen. Is it possible that the disciples stole the body? Yes, that is possible, although highly unlikely because it was guarded and a huge stone was blocking the entrance. And even if they did manage to steal it, the fact that the disciples were willing to die for the belief that Jesus rose from the dead would be absurd. Then they would know that their story was false. People might be willing to die for something that in the end isn't true, but they are not willing to die for something they know is false. And besides these facts, more than 500 people claim to have seen the risen Jesus. It is highly improbable that they all joined the disciples in the big conspiracy. This brings us to the last criterion. There is no bias or ulterior motive. Maybe you are not yet convinced and you still think that a conspiracy is more probable than an actual resurrection. The question we need to address is, why would the disciples start the conspiracy? What did they gain from this lie? J. Warner Wallace, a former cold case detective, found that in murder cases there are three main motives for any murder: sex, money, or power. These same motives can be applied to all crimes, such as making up a conspiracy. Let's watch.
What are the motives that people have to commit a crime or create a conspiracy?
Yeah, the only time anyone does anything they shouldn't do, they're driven by something. What is motivating them? And people like to think about that. And it's really quite simple. It's either going to be sex, money, or the pursuit of power. And that issue of sex, money, and the pursuit of power, that helps you to investigate cases because you can actually go to motive and think to yourself, okay, well, who would have an advantage? Who would have something to gain from either sex, money, or power that might do such a thing, do this murder, do this crime, whatever it may be? And those really are quite simple motives. Now, people will offer sometimes, well, what about like jealousy? Well, what are you jealous about? What about vengeance? What are you feeling vengeful about? It's going to come back, if you drill down deeper, to one of those three motives for any misbehavior.
So if the disciples lied, then they must have been driven by sex, money, or power. But now there's a big problem. By proclaiming the risen Jesus, they didn't gain, but lost all these things. Let's start with money. The disciples left their homes to follow Jesus and they were chased from place to place without much possessions. That's why the Apostle Paul said, "To the present hour we hunger and thirst, we are poorly dressed and buffeted, and homeless. And we labor, working with our own hands. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We have become, and are still, like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things." The second motive is sex. Jesus was clear in his teaching that sex is only allowed within a marriage between a man and a woman. He said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." This is also what the disciples taught. They restricted themselves to Jesus' ethics about sex, so they weren't driven by sex. The last motive is power. It is true that after a couple of centuries, Christianity became the dominating religion, and the Pope would have a lot of power. But this was not the case for first century Christians. A basic form of power any person should have is the ability to protect oneself from harm. Christians even lacked this basic ability, so they were powerless. The Christian movement faced brutal persecution, especially under the reign of Nero. Monotheistic Christianity was seen as offensive to the polytheistic Roman Empire. Christians were unwilling to worship Nero because they only worshipped the Christian God. Historian Tacitus said the following: "Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by populace. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired." Christians were brutally martyred for their faith. We can conclude that the apostles were not driven by power, because they not only gained no power, they lost even the most basic power a human can have, the ability to protect oneself from harm. So, to conclude, the events are highly improbable. They conform to an independently given pattern. It is highly improbable that humans can cause these events. And finally, the early Christians did not have ulterior motives. This means that the best explanation for these facts is that God miraculously raised Jesus from the dead. In other words, if these historical facts are in fact facts, then Christianity is true.